Hi everybody, this is George Gamba. I am a registered migration agent with the Mara and I work at Aussizz Group. I'm coming to you live to discuss a little bit further on what my colleague Path talked about yesterday, which is the skilled visas. Now I'll be discussing today skilled visa options outside of the point system. Now, as some of you might be aware, in Australia, you need one of 5 things to become a permanent resident. You either need to have points in an occupation on the approved list, and this will usually be an occupation on the long-term list, unless it is on the short-term list but a state sponsors it. Say for example, accountant is on the long-term list, so you can access it through the point system anywhere in Australia. But occupations like marketing specialist, advertising specialist, and cook, they're only accessible if one of the states or territories is sponsoring it. And usually the state will have requirements on top of immigration points. For example, South Australia, they require you to be there for 6 months or study for 12 months. Tasmania is the same thing. Queensland requires you to be working there for 6 months, although Queensland is currently closed. But we expect it to open up again in July. Victoria will require some form of experience, usually between 3 to 5 years. WA would require you to be a graduate of WA. Canberra would require you to be there for between 1 and 2 years. And the Northern Territory will require you to be there between 6 to 12 months. Outside of the point system, the second thing you would need to have to become a permanent resident, so that is the second option, is to have an employer, to have a sponsor that's willing to keep you and give you a job in an occupation that is also on one of the approved lists. It can be the 186 list or the 187, or you can be sponsored temporarily, let's say on a 482 visa, and then you can move on to a PR later on. But you can also be sponsored, and this is what I'm going to be talking about today, on a 407 list. So some of you who maybe just graduated, you don't have 2 years experience to be sponsored on a work visa. You might have an employer that is willing to keep you, that might want to train you up a little bit more so you can get the skills to jump on a work visa later on. That's what I'm going to be speaking to you about mostly today: the 407 visa, the 186 visa, a little bit on the 187 visa. I've already discussed the 482 work visa in a previous video. You can have a look that below. Or you can enter on a 482 visa under a designated area agreement, so on one of the Dhammas. I'll be discussing a little bit about the Dhammas later on. Now, the other 3 things you would need to have, but not all at the same time. You would need either to have a sponsor, like a family sponsor, like a partner, or your parents, or if you have children in Australia, they can sponsor you. Or you would need to go on a temporary protection visa, right, as a refugee. Or you can have investments, so investor visas, which we also do at Aussizz Group. We can help individuals with the investment visas. So going back to point number 2, the 407 visa is a training visa. Think about it as the light version of the work visa, the 482 visa. It is a visa that if you've just graduated, let's say with a Masters of Accountancy, but you don't quite have the points yet to apply for PR, to be invited, but you have an employer that is willing to keep you, and you don't have 2 years experience, which is the minimum required to go on a 482 TSS work visa, your employer could consider sponsoring you on a training visa. Now, the training visa is very similar to the TSS in that your employer has to be first set up as an approved sponsor. They need to nominate you, and then you need to make a visa application in which you can include your family. Now, for the step number 1, which is the sponsorship, your employer needs to show that they're a lawfully trading business in Australia, that they have the funds to pay you and everybody else in the company, that they're registered for GST, all the usual things that a sponsor would need to show. right? That they're a company that operates in Australia, that has business in Australia, that has a turnover, that can use that money to pay you. Now, the key difference between the 482 visa and the training visa is that the 482 requires 2 years experience and is it is a work visa. The training visa, on the other hand, as the name suggests, it's a visa that it is intended to train people, to give you some skills while you either build up the necessary skills to move on to a work visa, or you acquire the necessary skills to register in your profession, like in the profession of nursing, or that builds you up for capacity building overseas. There are 3 streams in this 407 nomination, but I'll be discussing mostly the one that is about training you up to go onto a work visa down the line. So in the nomination, there's no need for your employer to conduct labor market testing. They don't have to put ads up for 28 days and try to look for an Australian who can do your job. The difference lies in the fact that the nomination for a 407 visa needs to have a training plan. Now, as the name suggests, it is a training visa, so your employer will be nominating you for some training, right? And they will need to identify someone in the company who is more qualified than you to give you training. They will need to come up with a training plan that has actual outcomes, that has measurable responsibilities, and that is around 30 hours worth of training per week. Okay, you can do training that is outside the scope of the occupation, but it needs to be specific and it needs to be shown in a training plan with outcomes, and you need to show this to your case officer. This is something as well that we can help employers, and we routinely help a lot of employers with, which is to come up with training solutions to keep those overseas employees who don't quite have the necessary points for a skilled visa and who do not have the 2 years minimum experience requirement to go on a fully fledged work visa. Okay, now the third step, so you have the sponsorship, step number 1, nomination, step number 2, there's step number 3, which is the actual visa application. Now, the training visa, it is a temporary visa, so the government will expect you that at the end of the training visa you most likely will go back home. Now, some of you, the goal is to get PR, so you wouldn't necessarily be thinking of going back home, but you need to show that you're a genuine temporary entrant, the same way that you do when you apply for a student visa. So when you apply for a student visa, as some of you will know who are on student visas, you need to tell the case officer why you are coming to Australia, what's the benefit of the course in your future, why you've chosen the school, why you've chosen to live where you live, and why couldn't you do this course in your home country. And when you put all those things together, that is what you give to your case officer, those reasons, to explain why you've come to Australia to study. Now, in a GTE, you wouldn't put that you're coming because you want to live permanently in Australia. That will get you refused. In the same way, on a 407 training visa, you need to show why you are taking the training, what's the benefit of this training in your career, why this company, and how this training makes sense in the context of the company. So, for example, if you're working, let's say, at a pharmacy, but they want to sponsor you as a trainee accountant, it would need to make sense in the context of that business. And probably an accountant wouldn't make sense. More pharmacists would, a chemist would, but not an accountant. An accountant would make more sense, of course, in an accounting firm or one of the big consultancy firms. Now, with the individual components of the 407 visa, you need to make a visa application. Now, the cost is a lot less than on a work visa. A work visa can cost you up to $2,500. The training visa is only $285 per applicant. In the training visa, you still need to meet the health requirement, so you would take out insurance, so overseas visitors cover will do. Then you still need to show you have the skills for a training visa. And this usually means you are either a recent graduate from a university or that you have at least 12 months experience in the occupation. Now, it doesn't have to be skilled experience, it can be exposure. The key difference between the 407 and the TSS. The TSS needs you to have relevant skilled experience. The training visa, the skill requirement is a lot lower because you're meant to be going on to be trainee. Then you still need to meet finances. Now, in the training visa, you can be working full-time, and part of the finance calculation for you will be showing that your wages in the future, over the course of the 1 to 2 years on which a training visa can be granted, you will earn X amount of money. That can go towards the finance calculation because you need to show you have the necessary funds to cover your stay in Australia. And this is similarly calculated as with the student visas. The student visas, as some of you will know, it's around $21,000 in living costs. Then you add about $8,000 for your secondary, and then thereafter for if you have any children, so that's $4,000, right? So we're looking at around $35,000 per year. It's a similar calculation on the training visa, okay? But unlike the student visa, in the student visa calculation, you can't tell the Department of Immigration that you're going to work, so therefore you're going to make money to pay for your course. It's not like that. But on the training visa, you can. You can show that, you know, I will earn over 55K a year doing this job, and plus my individual savings and maybe a credit loan or support from my parents, I have the necessary funds to come to Australia and take the necessary training. Some of the occupations you can take a training visa on are like physiotherapist, registered nurse, you've got software engineer, accountant. So, you know, for some of you who are recent graduates of universities here in Australia, but you've never worked in that occupation, and let's say that you're on your 45 visa or you're about to be on your 45 visa, but you might not have enough time to accumulate experience for a TSS work visa, you might consider a training visa. Now, of course, you need to have an employer. So all the visa options that I'm discussing today are dealing with having an employer sponsor. Okay? So outside of the point system, you either have your own skills assessment and enough points to be invited by the Department of Immigration for a permanent residence visa, or you have an employer. Those are the two options on the table in terms of as far as skilled visa goes, and then there's other options like investment visas. So if you don't have enough points, if you don't have enough experience, then a training visa outside of a student visa is potentially a way that you can stay here a little bit longer, but get genuine training, make connections with employees on the ground, and then potentially while you're on the training visa, you can accumulate enough points to then be invited. Now at the moment, as my colleague Parth talked about yesterday, immigration is getting tougher, the points are getting higher, there's less invitations, and in the context of all of this, in Australia we have around 160,000 places for new migrants every year. But within all those 160,000 places, you have the refugee intake, parents, children's, partners, employer-sponsored, and points. Now, the point system is getting a little bit trickier, a little bit tougher, because part of the rationale is that there has been a lot of skilled visa holders in Australia who, let's say, nominate an occupation like mechanical engineer, but when they get to Australia, they actually never work as a mechanical engineer, they work in other occupations. So what the government is trying to do is trying to push people more towards trying to get an employer, right? And this is where things like the Dharmas come into play. The Dharmas, there's this designated area migration agreements, and they are basically like regional visas that have to do with an employer. You cannot apply for a Dharma on your own like you would for 189 or 190. You need to have an employer. Okay, so but just going back to the 407 visa, so you need to have insurance, you need to show finance, you need to show you're a genuine temporary entrant. You can include your dependents on a 407 training visa, but just be mindful that they will have restricted work rights of only 40 hours a fortnight. So unlike the TSS full work visa, that if you have a dependent or a secondary applicant, they get full-time work rights. On the 407 visa, they only get 40 hours a fortnight, which is similar to what a student who's studying a bachelor's would get for their secondary dependent. Now, you also need to show that you meet the English requirement, but this is a lot lower than for the full work visa. On the training visa, you only need to show you have equivalent of IELTS 4.5, which is PT 32. So the requirements are lower, the skill requirement is lower. You need to show that you're a GTE, but this visa can potentially give you some time to gather your points, right? So the training visa, it is not very often considered as an option, but I can tell you that it is a very good option. If you have an employer, if you have someone who you're working with, and who is willing to keep you, to support you, to give you some training while you get up the skills to either go on your own for a points visa, or you can apply for a full work visa after you get 2 years experience post qualification. So that's basically how the training visa works. We do them all the time here at Aussizz. Feel free to drop me a line. I'll leave my email in the comments. I'll be answering some of your questions as well, and I'll leave my email and my WhatsApp number. And if you need to chat about any of the visas that I've mentioned before, just let me know. So that's the 407 training visa in a nutshell. It's a training visa, not meant to be a work visa, although it really is a work visa. You can work full time on it. Then we move on to the 42 TSS work visa, which I've spoken to you guys about in the past. And that visa is a full work visa. You need to have 2 years in the occupation. You need to have an occupation that is on one of the lists. If your occupation, let's say chef, it is on the medium to long term list, you can be sponsored for up to 4 years. If, let's say, you're a marketing specialist, then you can be sponsored for up to 2 years with a renewable term of 2 years, and then after that you need to work out your options. Now with that visa, I've already done a detailed video on that, so I'll just leave that there for now. I'll move on to the other side of the spectrum, which is the 186 visa. Now the 186 visa is a visa that is for permanent residence, but you need a sponsor. If you do find a sponsor, let's say you haven't worked with them yet, but they're willing to keep you, and you already have at least 3 years experience in an occupation on the long-term list, like software engineer, like physiotherapist, like accountant, like chef, like cabinet maker, like carpenter, like nurse, in most of these occupations, right? If you have 3 years experience, your employer can nominate you directly for permanent residence without you even having to work a day with them before. So the 186 visa in a nutshell is a visa that is meant to give employees some stability, because on a TSS work visa you can switch sponsors. If you find a better paying job somewhere else, you can resign and they can take over your sponsorship. On the 186 visa, you make a commitment that you're going to stay with that employer for at least 2 years after you get your permanent residence, right? And as long as you have 3 years experience plus a skills assessment in an occupation on the medium to long-term list, then that employer can nominate you for permanent residence in the direct stream of the 186. Now, if you don't have that much experience, but you have at least 2 years, you can nominate for 1 year on a TSS visa and then apply for direct entry through the 186. Alternatively, if you don't have enough English to get a skills assessment, but you do to get the visa, then that's fine. You can stay with your employer for between 3 to 4 years, and in that time they can nominate you for PR. There are 2 streams, as I mentioned: direct entry stream, in which you can go for PR directly without ever having to work with that employer before. You will need to make a commitment that you're going to work with them for 2 years. Or you have the TRT, which for some of you who have applied for 457 visas before the 17th of April 2017, you can still access this stream. So for cooks, for marketing specialists, restaurant managers, if you had applied for a visa and that visa was granted back in April 2017, you can still access the TRT stream doing only 2 years with an employer. For everybody else who is on the medium to long-term list, and unfortunately cooks and restaurant managers are not on this list, then your only option is to stay with your employer for 3 years, do TRT with them, and then get your PR. So outside of the training visa, in which you need very little skills, or the 186 visa, in which you need at least 3 years experience, there are other things that the government is coming up to ensure that all the areas in Australia get enough employees to fill the vacancies that are there in the economies of those regional areas. So in Warrnambool, there is now a Dharma. In the Northern Territory, there is a Dharma now. And in South Australia, there will be a Dharma starting from the 1st July 2019. So the Dharmas are basically work visas that require less things from either you or your employer. So for example, on the Dharma for the Northern Territory, there are occupations in there like bookkeeper, accounts clerk, excavator, and hotel receptionist that are not present in the 482 list. So those are occupations that in which you can be sponsored in the Northern Territory, but you couldn't be sponsored, let's say, as an accounts clerk in Melbourne or Sydney or Brisbane. And the purpose of this is to lower the barrier of entry into these occupations so that more people can access them and more people will go and live in these regional areas where there is a shortage of skilled people. In South Australia, they've come up with a very good Dharma in which people who have, up to 55 years old in some occupations can access permanent residence. As some of you will know, the limit to get permanent residence through the skilled visa is 45 years old. Now, the Dharma in South Australia is going to make it easier for people in the occupation, let's say a dentist, or age or disabled carer, or hospitality and accommodation manager, or even cafe or restaurant manager. Those occupations, if you're someone who has a lot of experience, but you unfortunately missed out on applying for permanent residence because of your age, then in South Australia, you can still apply under these occupations through an employer for permanent residence. And there are other concessions that the government is giving as an incentive for employers to sponsor overseas employees. So they're lowering the barrier in terms of the salary, because the basic salary that you can pay someone on a work visa is $53,900. What the government is saying is that in these areas like the Northern Territory, like Warrnambool in Victoria, or like in South Australia, is that you can be offered a salary with at least or at the most 10% of that salary. So that would work around to be around $48,500. The barrier of entry is also lowered on the English. So for some of these visas, the Your regular score that you need is IELTS 5 or PT 36. What is happening in the Dharma areas in South Australia, in the Northern Territory, in Warrnambool, is that you can be sponsored there even if you don't have IELTS 5. You can have IELTS 4.5, PT 32. And also for some occupations, there are on skill level number 4, and I'll just briefly explain what the skill levels are. So skill level number 1 is where you need a bachelor qualification or 5 years experience to meet the skill requirement, and this will be something like accountant. You need at least a bachelor's qualification. In some occupations like medical practitioner, you cannot substitute the need for a qualification. You need to go to med school. Now, that's skill level number 1. You need at least a bachelor's. Skill level number 2 is where you need at least a diploma. So, restaurant manager, skill level 2. Chef, skill level 2. You need at least a diploma. Then you got skill level number 3, which is you need at least a certificate 4. So, cook is one of them. And then you have skill level 4, in which you need even less than that. You just need at least 2 years experience, like forklift driver. Like I've got here skill level 4, like bar attendant. Now, we are still in conversations with the Department of Home Affairs as to how they're going to interpret skill level 4. But in terms of, let's say you're actually a bar attendant, you're not even a bar manager, but just someone who works at a bar, you could potentially be sponsored on a work visa in Adelaide using the Dharmas, which is a pretty sweet deal, because usually to be sponsored on any other place in Australia, you will need to have qualifications and experience, or tons of experience. And what they're saying is that for some occupations, let's say on the skill level 4, let's say a bar attendant, then you may be sponsored without even having to go to college or university, or having 2 years experience. We'll have more details about these. We'll be releasing them as they come from immigration, but for now, these are the occupations that are going to be on the list for the Dharma. They're available on our website, and I'll post the link on my personal Jorge at Aussizz Facebook page. You can visit and you can get the link there. So just to recap, 407 visa, training visa, is a really good visa alternative. If you have an employer who's willing to keep you, but you don't have quite the points for your own skilled visa. Outside of that, there are work visa like the TSS visa, but you need at least 2 years experience. You have the 186 visas, in which you have at least 3 years experience and a skills assessment with an employer. And outside of them, you have the Dharmas, which at the moment they're in South Australia, Warrnambool, in the Northern Territory, and in which the barrier of entry is lower, which means that you can be sponsored as a forklift driver, or as a bar attendant, or as a hotel receptionist. You can be sponsored there on these kinds of occupation, but you couldn't be sponsored on them in Sydney or Melbourne. I hope you find the live useful. If you've got any questions for me, I'll be trying to answer all your questions at the end. If not, just drop me a line or come and see me. I'm at level 1, 290 Cotton Street. Thank you.